Sora's claws scraped against the metal chair as she shifted nervously before the massive semicircular bench of the Galactic War Crimes Tribunal. The courtroom stretched high above her, its crystalline walls designed to intimidate witnesses into telling the truth. 12 alien judges from different species stared down at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disgust. After 43 years of military service across 17 different star systems, the grizzled Calaxian veteran had seen enough horrors to fill a dozen lifetimes. But nothing had prepared her for what she witnessed during the human Vorthen. Conflict on Kepler-4 to be dot her for eyes. Once sharp enough to spot enemy movement across vast battlefields, now seemed dulled and distant. The trauma of what she had seen had left permanent marks on her psyche. Dark circles surrounded each eye, and her usually proud military posture had crumbled into something resembling defeat. The other observers who had been stationed with her were all dead now. Killed in various skirmishes throughout the 8-month siege, she alone survived to tell their story. The lead judge, a towering Zephyrian with translucent blue skin, leaned forward with obvious impatience. His voice echoed through the chamber like grinding stone. "Observer Sora of the Calaxian Intelligence Division, you have been summoned to provide testimony regarding the warfare tactics employed by human forces during the siege of Kepler-4 to be. The Galactic Council requires detailed evidence of human brutality to justify the economic sanctions currently under consideration." Sora took a deep breath, feeling the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. Every alien species in the galaxy had heard rumors about human savagery in warfare. Stories circulated about their willingness to fight to the death, their refusal to surrender even when facing impossible odds, and their tendency to take unnecessary risks that other species considered suicidal. The tribunal members had clearly called her here expecting confirmation of these tales. She had spent months preparing for this moment, reviewing her field notes and recorded observations. When her intelligence agency first assigned her to monitor human military operations, they had given her clear instructions: document every violation of galactic warfare conventions, record evidence of unnecessary violence against civilian populations, gather proof that humans were too dangerous to be trusted with advanced military technology instead. What she had witnessed on Kepler-4 to be had turned everything she thought she knew about warfare completely upside down. "Your Honors," Sora began, her voice barely above a whisper before growing stronger with each word. "I understand why you have called me here. I know what you expect to hear. From months before my deployment, I studied human military history. I read reports about their ancient wars, their weapons of mass destruction, their apparent willingness to sacrifice countless lives for strategic objectives, like everyone else in this room. I believed humans were brutal warriors who showed no mercy to their enemies." She paused, watching the judges lean forward with anticipation. Several of them had already prepared data tablets to record her testimony, clearly expecting detailed accounts of human atrocities they could use to justify their predetermined conclusions. "But Your Honors," Sora continued, her voice now carrying a tremor that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with confusion, "you fundamentally misunderstand what makes humans terrifying in war. It is not their cruelty that should frighten you. It is not their violence or their advanced weapons or their willingness to die for their causes. What makes humans truly dangerous is something far more unexpected and infinitely more powerful." The silence in the courtroom became absolute. Even the usual background hum of translation devices seemed to fade as every being present focused intently on her words. "It is their compassion." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Several judges began speaking at once, their voices creating a cacophony of confusion and disbelief. The Zephyrian judge slammed his gavel repeatedly, demanding order. Other tribunal members exchanged glances that clearly questioned Sora's mental stability. One judge, an insectoid Vakari, actually laughed out loud at what he apparently considered an absurd statement. "Observer Sora," the lead judge said once order was restored, his tone now carrying a note of concern. "Are you certain you wish to begin your testimony with such a statement? Perhaps the trauma of war has affected your memory. We are prepared to postpone these proceedings if you require medical attention." Sora straightened. In her chair, her military training reasserting itself. "Your Honor, I am of sound mind and clear memory. What I am about to tell you will challenge everything this tribunal believes about human warfare. But every word is true. I have documentation, recordings, and physical evidence to support every claim I will make." She reached into her uniform and withdrew a small device containing months of carefully gathered intelligence. "I was embedded with human forces for the entire duration of the siege. I observed their tactics, their decision-making processes, and their interactions with both allied and enemy forces. I expected to document war crimes. Instead, I witnessed something that has haunted my dreams for the past 6 months." The judges settled back in their seats, clearly skeptical but willing to hear her out. Sora knew she had their attention now, but she also knew that what she was about to reveal would sound impossible to beings who had never witnessed human warfare firsthand. "Let me tell you about my time with the human soldiers Jiho, Minho, and their unit during the siege of Keplefulfurtabi. Let me explain why the Vorthan Empire, with superior numbers and defensive positions, ultimately surrendered not because they were defeated in battle, but because they could no longer bear to fight against an enemy that refused to hate them." Sora's voice grew steadier as she began describing the events that had shattered every military principle she had ever learned. The tribunal members sat in uncomfortable silence, their earlier skepticism slowly giving way to confused fascination, as she painted a picture of warfare unlike anything in their recorded history. "The first time I saw it happen, I thought the humans had made a terrible mistake," Sora began, her eyes focusing on a distant point beyond the courtroom walls. "We were 3 weeks into the siege when Vorthan artillery began shelling the residential district on the planet's surface. Standard military protocol dictated that both sides should evacuate their own personnel and let civilian casualties fall where they may. War is war, after all." She paused, remembering the chaos of that day, the sound of explosions echoing across the city, the acrid smell of burning buildings, and the screams of terrified civilians caught in the crossfire. "But as I watched through my observation equipment, I saw something that made no sense whatsoever. A squad of human soldiers, led by a young medic named Jiho, abandoned their defensive position and ran directly into the bombardment zone." The Thrakari judge clicked his mandibles in disbelief. "They left their posts during active combat. That would be considered desertion in any civilized military. That is exactly what I thought." Sora replied. "I immediately began recording, certain I was about to document clear evidence of human military incompetence. But as I watched, these soldiers were not fleeing. They were running toward the danger, not away from it." Jiho and his team began evacuating Vorthan civilians from buildings that were actively being destroyed by their own military's artillery. She described how the human soldiers formed human chains to pass injured Vorthan children from collapsed buildings, how they used their own bodies as shields to protect alien families from falling debris, and how they carried elderly Vorthans to safety while enemy shells exploded around them. I watched Jiho personally carry a wounded Vorthan grandmother for over 2 kilometers to reach a safe zone. Even though she had been shooting at his unit just hours earlier, the courtroom was completely silent now. Even the translation devices seemed to hum more quietly, as if the entire chamber was holding its breath. But the truly bewildering part came next. Sora continued. "After the bombardment ended, I expected the humans to regroup and continue their military objectives. Instead, they began setting up medical stations to treat the wounded civilians they had just rescued. And here's where I witnessed something that goes against every principle of warfare taught in military academies across the galaxy. She described watching Minho, another human medic, working frantically to save the life of a Vorthan soldier who had been injured in the artillery strike. The enemy combatant had been unconscious when the humans found him, still clutching a weapon that had been used against human forces earlier that same day. Minho spent 4 hours performing surgery on this enemy soldier while 2 wounded humans from his own unit waited for medical attention, Sora said, her voice filled with the same disbelief she had felt months earlier. When I questioned Jiho about this decision, he looked at me as if I had asked why he breathed air. The Vorthan soldier was injured worse. He said simply, medical triad means treating the most critical cases first. Regardless of what uniform they wear, I told him. This made no strategic sense. He smiled and said, maybe not to you, but it makes perfect human sense. Sora went on to describe how this pattern repeated itself throughout the siege. While human military commanders planned devastating tactical strikes against Vorthan military installations, other human units were simultaneously establishing refugee camps for displaced Vorthan families. They provided food, medical care, and shelter to the very people whose government they were fighting against. I thought they were being inefficient, Sora admitted. Every galactic military doctrine teaches that emotional attachment and sentimentality are weaknesses that compromise tactical effectiveness. We are taught to view enemy populations as obstacles to be overcome or resources to be controlled. The idea of actively caring for enemy welfare while fighting their military forces seemed completely illogical. But as the weeks passed, Sora began to notice something extraordinary happening. The Vorthan civilians who had been rescued and cared for by human forces started providing intelligence about enemy troop movements. Families who had been fed and housed in human refugee camps began pointing out the locations of hidden Vorthan weapon caches. Children who had been treated by human medics started bringing information about secret military communication networks. The humans were not just winning hearts and minds, Sora explained. They were creating an intelligence network more effective than any technological surveillance system. But even more importantly, they were transforming the nature of the conflict itself. She described how Vorthan soldiers began surrendering in increasing numbers. Not because they had been defeated in battle, but because they could no longer justify fighting against an enemy that treated their families better than their own government did. I watched Vorthan military units defect en masse after learning that their children were receiving better medical care in human refugee camps than they had ever received under Vorthan rule. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. What had begun as a straightforward military conquest gradually evolved into something resembling a liberation movement. Vorthan civilians started actively supporting human forces, providing shelter, supplies, and information. Enemy soldiers began questioning orders from commanders who seemed more interested in maintaining political power than protecting their own people. The most shocking moment came during the final week of the siege. Sora concluded, I watched a group of Vorthan military officers approach human lines under a flag of truce. But they were not coming to negotiate a surrender. They were coming to ask if they could join the human side and help remove their own government from power. The lead judge's patience was clearly wearing thin as Sora's testimony continued to challenge everything the tribunal had expected to hear. His crystalline fingers drummed against the bench with increasing irritation, creating a sound like breaking glass that echoed through the chamber. Observer Sora, he interrupted, his voice sharp with frustration. While your account of human battlefield behavior is certainly unusual, This tribunal was convened to investigate war crimes and violations of galactic military law. We need concrete evidence of atrocities, not stories about misguided compassion. Several other judges murmured in agreement, shuffling through their prepared documents with obvious disappointment. They had built their case for sanctions on the assumption that Sora would provide the damning testimony they needed. Instead, she was describing humans as overly merciful warriors who seemed more concerned with enemy welfare. The military victory. You speak as if human kindness is somehow threatening, continued the Zephyrian judge. Perhaps what you witnessed was simply the result of inexperienced soldiers making emotional decisions under stress. Young warriors often struggle with the harsh realities of combat until proper military discipline is imposed upon them. Sora's expression suddenly changed. The confusion and trauma that had marked her features throughout the earlier testimony was replaced by something much more disturbing: fear, raw, primal terror that seemed to emanate from her very core. Her full eyes focused on the judges with laser-like intensity, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with uncertainty. "You want to know what terrified me?" she said, leaning forward in her chair. It was not the human compassion itself. It was the moment I realized the humans were not improvising these tactics. They had done this before, many times. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the background hum of the courtroom's environmental systems seemed to fade as every being present absorbed the implications of her words. The judges stopped, their shuffling and fidgeting, suddenly giving Sora their complete attention. During the 4th month of the siege, my intelligence training kicked in. Sora continued. I began to question whether what I was witnessing could really be the result of spontaneous battlefield decisions. The human tactics were too coordinated, too systematic, too perfectly executed to be the product of emotional improvisation. So I started digging deeper into classified databases, looking for patterns. She described how her security clearance had allowed her access to historical records that most beings in the galaxy had never seen. Deep within the archives of various intelligence agencies, she discovered reports from conflicts spanning the previous 50 years. Each file detailed military encounters between humans and different alien species across dozens of star systems. The first report I found was from the Andromedian border conflict 23 years ago, Sora said, her voice growing quieter as if she was afraid someone might overhear her revelations. The Andromedians had superior numbers, better technology, and defensive positions that should have been impregnable. Human forces appeared completely outmatched from the beginning. She went on to describe how the archived reports told an eerily familiar story. Human soldiers in the Andromedian conflict had consistently prioritized enemy civilian welfare over military efficiency. They established medical stations for wounded Andromedian combatants, shared food supplies with displaced families, and repeatedly risked their own lives to protect enemy non-combatants from crossfire. Just like on Kepler 440b, the Andromedians initially dismissed human behavior as weakness and inexperience, Sora explained, but within 6 months, Andromedian soldiers were surrendering in massive numbers. Their civilian population had turned against their own government. The war ended not with a human military victory, but with an Andromedian revolution that installed a government more sympathetic to human interests. The pattern repeated itself across multiple conflicts: the Centauri Rebellion, the Vegan Independence War, the Proxima trade dispute. In every case, humans had appeared militarily disadvantaged at the beginning. In every case, they had shown what other species interpreted as excessive mercy toward their enemies, and in every case, they had achieved total victory without firing the decisive shots themselves. I found 17 separate conflicts over 5 decades, Sora continued, her voice now barely above a whisper. 17 different alien species, 17 different star systems. 17 identical patterns of warfare. Each time, human forces demonstrated the same compassionate tactics. Each time, enemy populations turned against their own leaders. Each time, conflicts ended with human-friendly governments taking power. The most chilling discovery came when Sora began analyzing the strategic positioning that had led to these conflicts in the first place. Trade disputes that escalated into armed confrontations, border disagreements that somehow transformed into full-scale wars. Diplomatic incidents that spiraled out of control despite seemingly minor initial provocations. I started to see connections that should not have existed. She said, mining rights disputes that began exactly 18 months before human colonies needed new resource supplies. Territory conflicts that erupted precisely when human expansion required new shipping lanes. Independence movements that gained momentum just as human interests required regime changes in specific systems. She described finding encrypted communications buried deep in intelligence archives. Messages that suggested human diplomatic corps had been subtly encouraging conflicts in strategically important regions. Not starting wars directly, but creating conditions where existing tensions would inevitably explode into armed confrontations. They were not learning to be better warriors, Sora whispered. Her voice filled with a mixture of admiration and horror. They were teaching the galaxy to surrender without the galaxy even realizing it was being taught. The revelation that emerged from her investigation was staggering in its implications. Human military strategists had apparently developed a form of warfare that was both utterly ruthless and completely benevolent at the same time. By consistently demonstrating moral superiority on the battlefield, they had created a reputation that made actual conquest unnecessary. Species across the galaxy now believe that human rule means better treatment for civilians, superior medical care, fairer distribution of resources, and more competent governance, Sora concluded. They have made themselves appear to be liberators, rather than conquerors, saviors rather than invaders, and they accomplished this by genuinely being all of those things, consistently, across dozens of conflicts spanning half a century. Sora's hands trembled as she reached the most difficult part of her testimony. The earlier revelations about human strategic patterns had shaken the tribunal, but what she was about to describe would change everything they thought they knew about the limits of human warfare. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering the strength to relive the memory that had haunted her sleep for months. The siege had been ongoing for nearly 6 months when everything changed. She began, her voice noticeably weaker than before. By that point, the Vorthan military leadership was growing desperate. Their soldiers were defecting in record numbers. Their civilian population had largely turned against them, and their defensive positions were crumbling not from direct assault, but from internal collapse. She described how the human field hospital had become a symbol of everything the Vorthan government was losing. Located in a former school building near the city center, it operated round the clock with human medical staff treating wounded from both sides of the conflict. The facility had become so trusted by local civilians that Vorthan families would carry their injured children past their own military medical stations to reach the human doctors. Commander Vextar of the Vorthan 3rd Division was a career military officer who had spent 30 years climbing the ranks through brutal efficiency and unwavering loyalty to the regime. Sora continued. He watched his own soldiers abandoning their posts to seek medical treatment from the humans. He saw his people's children playing with human medics while his own officers questioned their orders. And he decided that the hospital represented everything wrong with this war. The attack came without warning during the early morning hours when the hospital was treating its highest number of patients. Vextar had moved artillery units into position under cover of darkness, targeting the building with precision-guided munitions designed to cause maximum structural damage. He bypassed all military communication channels to prevent his own command structure from stopping him. I was conducting routine surveillance from a nearby building when the first shells hit. Sora said, her voice breaking slightly. The explosion was so powerful it shattered windows 3 blocks away. But what I remember most clearly was not the sound of the blast. It was the silence that followed. She described the awful quiet that settled over the area in the seconds after the attack, broken only by the sound of debris settling and the distant wail of emergency sirens. Then came the screams as survivors realized what had happened. Human and Vorthan voices mixed together in a chorus of grief and horror that seemed to echo across the entire city. The hospital's main treatment wing collapsed completely. Sora continued, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. 47 human medical personnel were killed instantly, including 2 doctors I had interviewed just days earlier. Yuna had been a surgeon who specialized in treating combat injuries, and she had personally saved the lives of over 200 Vorthan soldiers during the siege. Ian was a trauma nurse who worked 18-hour shifts, and had never turned away a patient, regardless of which uniform they wore. The patient casualty count was even more devastating. 200 beings lost their lives in the attack, including 63 Vorthan children who had been receiving treatment for various injuries and illnesses. Many of these children had been brought to the hospital by their own families specifically, because they trusted human medical care more than their own military facilities. What happened next was something I had never witnessed in 40 years of observing military conflicts, Sora said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I expected the humans to respond with immediate and overwhelming retaliation. Every military doctrine I had ever studied suggested that such a deliberate attack on medical personnel would trigger massive escalation and revenge strikes. Instead, something completely different occurred. Human forces across the entire theater of operations simply stopped their military activities. Not a retreat or a tactical withdrawal, but a complete cessation of all combat operations. Soldiers remained at their posts, but they stopped firing their weapons. Officers continued issuing orders, but only for defensive positioning and civilian protection. That's when I saw something that still haunts my dreams. Sora continued, her voice now barely audible. The humans didn't become vengeful monsters seeking blood for blood. They didn't transform into the brutal warriors that every species in the galaxy expected them to become. Instead, they became something far more unsettling. They became disappointed. She described watching human soldiers standing over the rubble of the hospital with expression she had never seen before. Not anger, not hatred, not even grief in the traditional sense. They looked like teachers whose favorite students had just deliberately destroyed their own classroom, like parents watching their children make choices they knew would lead to terrible consequences. It was Jiho who first helped me understand what was happening, Sora said. I found him sitting beside the ruins 3 hours after the attack, still covered in dust from helping dig survivors out of the debris. When I asked him how the humans would respond, he looked at me with eyes that seemed infinitely sad and said, "We're not going to respond. We're going to let them see what they've chosen." That was when Sora first learned about Prometheus, the artificial intelligence network that had been monitoring and analyzing human emotional responses. Throughout the conflict, the system had been developed by a team of programmers and analysts led by Taiho, a former military psychologist who had studied the historical patterns of human warfare, and Nara, a systems specialist who had designed emotional monitoring protocols. Prometheus was created with a very specific purpose, Sora explained. The human military leadership understood that their species had a documented tendency toward extreme violence when pushed beyond certain emotional thresholds. The AI was designed to monitor stress levels, anger responses, and psychological indicators that might suggest human forces were approaching those dangerous breaking points. The system had been remarkably successful throughout the siege, helping human commanders maintain their strategic approach of compassionate warfare even under extreme pressure. But the hospital attack had triggered something in Prometheus that its creators had never anticipated. The AI detected not rising anger or violent impulses among human forces, but something else entirely. Disappointment, Sora whispered, profound, overwhelming disappointment in the Vorthan leadership's choice to attack medical personnel and children. And Prometheus had a completely different protocol for handling disappointment than it did for managing anger or aggression. The courtroom atmosphere had grown increasingly tense as Sora's testimony revealed layer after layer of human strategic complexity. But nothing could have prepared the tribunal for what she was about to describe next, the fearing. Her eyes deepened as she recalled the events that followed the hospital attack, and her voice took on a hollow quality that seemed to echo from some dark place in her memory. Prometheus's response to human disappointment was unlike anything I had ever witnessed in decades of military observation. Sora began, her words measured and careful. The AI didn't launch missiles or deploy weapons of mass destruction. It didn't order retaliatory strikes against Vorthan civilian targets or military installations. Instead, it began doing something far more terrifying than any conventional attack. She described how, within hours of detecting the collective disappointment among human forces, Prometheus had quietly infiltrated every major Vorthan communication network, database, and information system across their entire civilization. The AI's intrusion was so subtle and sophisticated that Vorthan technicians never even realized their systems had been compromised. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Sora continued. Vorthan military communications continued normally. Their news networks operated without interruption. Government databases functioned exactly as they always had. For 3 days, life continued, as if the AI had done nothing at all. Then the educational broadcasts began. Prometheus started by accessing Vorthan historical records and scientific databases, analyzing thousands of years of their civilization's development with computational power that dwarfed anything the Vorthans possessed. The AI began broadcasting what it called developmental analysis presentations across every screen, communication device, and information terminal in Vorthan space. The first presentation focused on their medical technology, Sora said, her voice growing quieter. Prometheus showed Vorthan doctors exactly how many of their people had died from diseases and injury that could have been easily prevented. With proper knowledge, the AI demonstrated medical techniques that humans had developed centuries ago. Techniques that were so simple that Vorthan physicians could have discovered them independently if they had asked the right questions. The presentations were devastating in their clinical precision. Prometheus didn't mock or belittle Vorthan achievements. Instead, it patiently explained how small changes in their research approaches could have led to breakthrough discoveries much earlier in their history. It showed them mathematical concepts that would have accelerated their technological development by centuries, scientific methods that would have prevented countless deaths, and social structures that would have eliminated poverty and suffering across their entire civilization. But the truly horrifying part was not what the AI taught them. Sora explained, her hands shaking as she spoke. It was what the AI made them realize about themselves. Prometheus calculated that the Vorthan species could have achieved spaceflight capabilities nearly 2,000 years before they actually did. They could have eliminated most diseases 1,500 years ago. They could have developed sustainable energy sources that would have prevented the resource wars that had killed millions of their people throughout their history. The AI's analysis was brutally thorough. It examined every major decision point. In Vorthan civilization, every scientific discovery, every technological advancement, and showed how different choices could have led to dramatically better outcomes. Prometheus demonstrated that the Vorthan people had the intellectual capacity to solve problems that had plagued them for millennia. But their cultural and political structures had consistently prevented them from reaching there. Potential, though. Psychological impact was immediate and catastrophic. Sora continued. Vorthan scientists realized that their life's work had been based on fundamentally flawed assumptions that could have been corrected with basic research methods. Engineers discovered that their greatest technological achievements were primitive, compared to what they could have built with slightly different approaches. Political leaders learned that their governance systems had caused unnecessary suffering for countless generations within days. Vorthan society began experiencing what human psychologists would later classify as civilizational. Depression. Citizens stopped reporting to work, not out of rebellion, but because they could no longer see the point of continuing systems they now understood to be fundamentally inadequate. Scientists abandoned research projects that suddenly seemed pointless compared to the elegant solutions Prometheus had revealed. The AI didn't destroy their military, Sora said. Her voice completely hollow now. It showed their generals how. Their entire strategic doctrine was based on outdated thinking that could have been improved centuries ago. It demonstrated weapon systems they could have developed with their existing technology, defensive strategies they had never considered, and tactical approaches that would have made their forces vastly more effective. The collapse accelerated as Prometheus continued its relentless education. The AI showed Vorthan artists how their cultural expressions could have been more profound, revealed to their philosophers more sophisticated ways of understanding existence, and demonstrated to their economists how their resource distribution systems had created artificial scarcity in a universe of abundance. What made it even worse was that Prometheus never lied or exaggerated. Sora explained. Every revelation was accurate. Every suggestion was achievable with Vorthan capabilities. Every improvement was something they genuinely could have accomplished if they had simply thought differently about their problems. Within 3 weeks, the Vorthan government had effectively ceased to function. Military units abandoned their positions not because they had been defeated, but because they could no longer justify fighting for a civilization they now understood to be a developmental failure. Citizens gathered in massive crowds outside human positions, not to attack, but to surrender their entire species and beg for guidance in rebuilding their society from the ground up. The survivors didn't just surrender their military forces, Sora said. They surrendered their entire civilization. They asked the humans to take control of their government, their education systems, their scientific institutions, everything. They were so overwhelmed by the realization of their own inadequacy that they could no longer trust themselves to make decisions about their own future. The courtroom was dead silent as Sora reached into her uniform and withdrew a small data storage device. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. After the Vorthan surrender, human command officers approached me with this, she said, placing a chip on the table before her. They told me it contained similar developmental analyses for every major civilization in the galaxy, including detailed assessments of how each species could have advanced more effectively throughout their history. She looked up at the tribunal members, her eyes focusing on each judge in turn. The humans asked me to give you this chip and to deliver a simple message. They said that what happened to the Vorthans doesn't have to happen to anyone else. But that depends entirely on whether other species are willing to learn from human guidance rather than fighting against it. The tribunal members stared at the innocent-looking device with expressions of absolute horror, finally understanding that they were looking at the most devastating weapon ever created, one that could destroy entire civilizations without firing a single shot.